Good morning. Let's go ahead and get ourselves started. If we could, please. My name is Dave Sepos. I am a managing senior mediator with the Consensus and Collaboration Program of the College of Continuing Education of Sacramento State. There will be a test on that name later, by the way. Formerly of the Center for Collaborative Policy, we've been moved into a new college and our name has changed, since I know everybody was losing sleep over that. Welcome to the April Food Safety Expert Panel meeting. I will go ahead and go through the agenda, then we'll go through introductions of the panel members and key staff, and then we will move on to the rest of the meeting. Let me first address just some basic logistics items for folks in the room. Please now silence your phones, if you could please, to make sure that we are not interrupted during the meeting. For people that are on the webcast, we will be checking in with you and with members of the public here in the room periodically for public comment. As always, using the email address that is listed on the project website and the agenda, you can feel free, members of the public online, to send in public comments and we will periodically read them into the record. If you have not been to this facility before and you need to use the restroom, you can go out these side doors right here down the hallway and then make your first left into the side corridor, and water fountain and restroom is there. With regards to public comments at this time and just relative to how we've historically done things in this meeting, there are no public comments that have been entered in or sent in prior to today's meeting, so I have nothing to read into the record. But again, anything that is sent in during the meeting, Rebecca will let us know, and either she or I will go ahead and read those comments in. With regards to public comments here in the room, again, as we always do, we will have periods of time at each agenda item to open up the floor for the public. As a reminder, and this is just, again, a disclaimer, standard disclaimer. As a reminder, this is a meeting of the food expert panel that is open to the public, which means that this is a working meeting for the panel to do its work and for the public to provide comments. There are times, as we've indicated before, where the panel feels the need to have closed technical discussions, which we have done in the past, and those meetings are always documented with meeting summaries such as these meetings. In this circumstance, as I said, we'll open up the floor for public comment at the end of each agenda item. I would like to remind everybody that when public comments are made, a few things. The panel is under no obligation to respond to any questions or comments that members of the public make. They can choose to if not, but they're under no obligation to do so. I encourage all members of the public to remember that public comment is not a time period for point to counterpoint between one commenter and another commenter. And as always, just in the case of civility and decorum, please recall and remember to not make public comments turn any kind of personal affront or back and forth. It's just a matter for you to make a public comment for the panel to hear. And again, if the panel should choose to weigh in, they can choose to do so. Let me go ahead and go over the agenda right now. In a minute, we'll just do a quick review of the January public meeting and see if there's any final comments on the meeting summary, at which point we will adopt that document as it is currently or as modified into the final project record. We will then have a presentation by panel member Dr. Barbara Peterson, who is calling in remotely and is on the line right now, and we'll go through that PowerPoint at that time. I'll give more background on that when we get to there. We're going to get a presentation from the consultant that's been brought on and that is now going to be handling the sampling activities going forward, Dr. Robert Schofield. We'll get an update on fruit sampling activities from the last round, and as with all of these, we'll be having panel discussion when need be. We'll then get an overall update on the food safety panel. We'll move to lunch. We'll aim to be getting to lunch at around noon, and we'll see where we are on the agenda. Things might go longer or perhaps shorter, but we anticipate going to lunch after the food safety project update, but prior to the report on the waste discharge received presentation, which would be item number 7, which will be provided by Clay Rogers, the Assistant Executive Officer of the Board. We'll go to final public comment, next steps and action items, and close ourselves out. So that is the agenda. At this time, what I would like to do is allow the panel members, first starting with the folks on the dais, to introduce themselves and their organization. Then we'll go to Barbara Peterson on the phone. we'll go to staff, and then we'll proceed. So starting at my left, Dr. Beam, and again, panel members, do remember to turn your mics on when you're speaking.
Steve Beam, I'm Chief of Milk and Dairy Food Safety with the Animal Health and Food Safety Services Division, California Department of Food and Agriculture.
Bruce Mackler, US EPA. I'm the Water Program Toxicologist in Region 9 in San Francisco.
Gabrielle Ludwig, Director for Sustainability and Environmental Affairs with the Almond Board of California.
Seth Shonkoff, I'm Executive Director of PSE and have research affiliations at UC Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab.
PSE stands for?
Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy.
Thank you.
Andy Gorders, I'm a staff toxicologist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Fresno.
Very good. Then continuing around, staff and...
Rebecca Asami, I'm staff of the Regional Board.
Josh Mahoney, engineer with the Water Board.
Alex Colweiss, I work with Dave Seppos at Sacramento State.
I'm Will Stringfellow. I'm serving as science advisor. I'm a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory.
Carl Longley, a member Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board.
Patrick Palupa, incoming executive officer of the Central Valley Water Board.
Clay Rogers, assistant executive officer of the Water Board.
And Barbara, if you choose to introduce yourself, please.
I'm Barbara Peterson from Exponent.
Very good. So just one final item before we go on to agenda item number 2. Obviously, we only have one individual on the phone with us today, and that's Barbara. But just for panel members here in the room, please note that what I'll generally do is take 2 to 3 comments max from panel members, and then we'll always be checking back in with Barbara to make sure that she's not being forgotten if she's got any feedback in any of your discussions. So just be aware of that. Okay, let's move on to item number 2, the review of the January meeting summary and the panel meeting. So at this time, I'm going to draw everybody's attention. We have copies of the meeting summary over there on the table, and this has been provided to panel members some weeks ago. Are there any comments or adjustments that panel members would like to make or staff would like to make to this document? Hearing none and seeing none, that document will be adopted as final from the January 24th meeting. Moving on then to item number 3, we're going to move straight on to the presentation. Barbara, give me a minute to, I'm going to grab the wireless keyboard so I can, and Jean, is Jean here? Or do you have the, are you going to pull it up, Alex? Or you got the, just grab the keyboard if you could. Okay. Jean, is that the presentation that's up on the, oh, thank you. Is that it? There we go, okay. Oh, the other one, okay, whoopsie. Sorry, folks, hold on. Sorry, Barbara.
Not a problem.
Wait, this one?
Can everyone hear me while there's...
Yeah, we can hear you. This one? Alex. All right. So what we're going to do here is obviously Barbara is remote. She will be encouraging me to, or telling me when to go ahead and change the screen, and I will do so. We did a test earlier. Barbara, you can still hear me okay through the microphone system. Is that correct?
I can.
Okay, great. That means we'll be able to hear questions and comments in real time. Just by way of background, this presentation came about in the January discussion under the risk and exposure assessment conversation that took place. If anybody wants to make reference to it, it was on page 8 of the meeting summary. And during that conversation, Dr. Peterson had suggested that she could provide this kind of a discussion as a means of spurring conversation about what the panel may want to be making some further recommendations or targeting. So with that, Barbara, I'm going to go ahead and hand it directly over to you. And like I said, you just go ahead and tell me when to advance.
Okay. Just by way of sort of putting the whole thing in framework, as data are being collected to determine the levels of compounds that are present in the various foods, the next question becomes, well, what does that translate into in terms of consumer exposure? And so we had done, I think we had a couple of people had done real quick back-of-the-envelope calculations. And so I said, well, why don't, it's probably time now to go ahead and go to the national data and identify the food consumption data that we want to use in combination with the concentration of the chemicals data to estimate consumer exposure. And that's what basically I do most of the time. I do exposure assessments, and we use food consumption data a lot for that. So I went to the data and I took a look and picked out what I believe are the best data to use for this. But I'm presenting this today to talk about what the data are and some choices for how we frame these analyses. So this is very much a draft, and I think the panel may really want different combinations or different thoughts. So I thought what I'd like to do is just go through how I made those decisions and perhaps what some of the other options are, and then we can decide what you would like me to do as the final set of analyses. For food consumption data, there is really one national food consumption survey which is used by almost everybody who wants to know what Americans eat. And it's titled What We Eat in America. It's the dietary component of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Some component of this survey has been done since in the 1930s. It began as really a nutrition survey, was used to estimate what our food supply is providing to consumers, where are we short on nutrients, that sort of thing. It's been broadened since then, gotten more detailed, gets constrained because of budgets, but it's continued to be done. And in the 70s, it went from being done every 10 years to being done on a continuous basis. So there's always a survey in the field being done. I think if you ask anybody who uses it, they would say it's nationally representative. It has the benefit of the National Center for Health Statistics statisticians in identifying the panels, in calculating statistical basis for this so that it really truly is statistically representative. It also has the benefit of the U.S. Department of Agriculture interview teams that have been doing these studies since the 1930s, who do things like figure out how do you get a consumer to accurately represent how much they ate. And they've done a lot of testing of that, starting to use new technologies and not so much have to go door to door to do it. Since it's done on an ongoing basis, you have to decide which part of the survey you're going to use. And that's frankly arbitrary. What I think is useful and what I did for these preliminary analyses was start with the latest survey that's available in a format that we can use and go backwards until I had 15,000 individuals, so we have enough respondents for the foods we're interested in. We could go back to 2010, 2008. The survey's released in 2-year increments. Dave, I guess I forgot to tell you to go forward to page 2, slide 2.
Okay, done.
So that's what I've been talking a little bit about in terms of the national representativeness, but also the survey itself is done with each individual for 2 24-hour periods with trained interviewers to walk people through to make sure they haven't forgotten foods. And they do it in a very, I'm going to say, structured format. So they will start with your first meal of the day and ask you what time, ask you what you ate, and you might say, I had coffee, cereal, and fruit. and then they'll go back around that and say, okay, how much coffee? What did you put in it? They'll have food models, so they'll have other ways to talk about how to, was it a tablespoonful, that sort of piece. So they go through the whole 24 hours for that, and then they do a second 24 hours, but it's never consecutive. It's sometime in some 3 to 10 days later, and that's back to the statisticians of picking what day that will be. So they end up with every day of the year represented equally in the survey population. What do I think, or who uses
Barbara,
this?
should I advance it?
Let's just stay on this slide for a minute
Okay.
to talk about some of the who uses this data. It's used basically by EPA, by FDA, by USDA for doing risk assessments. It's done by USDA and pretty much everyone else who's looking at nutrition, looking at food security issues. The California government uses it. OHIA uses various forms of it. The Center for Disease Control uses it, and lots of academics. There are private surveys that are done that are available, and sometimes this study doesn't give you everything you need, so you can add to it. But it is really the major U.S. publicly available survey. I think some of the benefits of it are the statistics, that it is representative. It's broad spectrum in the sense that they really work to get low-income individuals, teenagers, all the kinds of people who don't, the busy mothers, to participate, and to the extent they don't participate enough, they develop statistical weights to make them representative. Another big benefit, and especially for us in this project, is that it's available record by record so that we can identify the individuals who ate the foods we're interested in. We know what their body weight is. We know how much they ate and that sort of thing. If I can have the next slide, there's lots of detail. Slide 3, that it would be, Dave.
This one?
Yeah. Oh, yes, exactly. I see what's happening because I'm looking on my slides, which are not going forward with yours.
Okay, so
so there are over 6,000 different foods that are reported as consumed by individuals in the 6 years we were interested in here, or in fact, I guess from 2011 to 2014. Yeah, let's stay right there for a minute, including the foods that we're likely to be wanting to do. And Dave mentioned this morning that maybe we should have done pistachios, and I can certainly add that. One piece and it's available in lots of different forms, whole fruits, juices, cooked, canned, frozen, and it tells us, frankly, that that's how it was eaten. What there's also the obvious limitation is that many of these foods are eaten in mixed dishes. The survey does capture those mixed dishes so that if you had a cake with almonds, that would be in the database. And if I can have the next slide. Dave? Yeah.
Yeah, I did it.
Slide.
It's on. It's there. Sorry. You want the one that says food selection - all commodities?
Right.
Yeah, there's probably a lag on
okay.
the web feed, but it's been changed here.
It's there. Okay. So what I've done is taken the USDA provides a food and nutrient database, the FNDDS, which has translated those 6,000 foods, each food, into its ingredients. And some of them are a one-to-one translation. If you had a handful of almonds, it'll be 100% almonds, and those are contained there. But it also has recipes that allow you to look at mixed dishes like that almond cake and to break that into almonds and flour and eggs on a percentage basis. And so I used that in order to estimate the commodities that we're interested in. And when I've told you what the intake of almonds was, it's only the almond components of that cake, not the flour and so forth in it. For the purposes of what I'm presenting today, I excluded a couple of things. The first were any of those 6,000 codes for which the ingredient we're interested in was less than 1%. So if somebody had put almond extract into a cake, that would have not been counted as a serving of almonds. And I've also excluded the specific baby food codes, which are basically commercial baby food, although you could have made it yourself. And I excluded both of those because they tend to be very small serving sizes, and I didn't want to force our per user estimates and our per capita estimates lower based on what are very small amounts of these commodities. So that's a completely arbitrary decision, but it's one that a lot of people who use this database follow. The baby food is very arbitrary, I think, but again, there's small portions, and the commodities that go into the baby food channel tend to be processed quite differently. So if I can have the next slide, which is the analysis parameters that I used for this analysis. Slide
There we go.
5.
And just again, for folks on the phone or folks on the web, there's up to a 30-second lag, I've been told. So just the next slide should ultimately say analysis parameters. Go ahead, Barbara. It's up on this in the room.
Okay. As I told you at the beginning, for each individual, we have 2 days of consumption. So I've used both of those and generated, if I'm calculating a mean value, I've averaged for each individual over their 2 days. And I then calculated both a per capita number, whether they did or didn't eat almonds, for example, and a per user number. If I counted an individual as a user, they consumed the commodity of interest, such as almonds, on at least one of the 2 days. I didn't require them to eat it on both days to be calculated as a user. I did the calculations for the total U.S. population, and I calculated a mean and a 90th percentile, both on a per capita basis, on a per user basis. And I also did the estimate in terms of units of grams per day and grams per kilogram body weight per day. And the grams per kilogram body weight per day were calculated using each responder's own body weight in the calculation, not a default population body weight. Obviously, these numbers, these endpoints are somewhat arbitrary, but they're used for, I think, different reasons and different applications. Per capita is broadly used when looking at food consumption patterns, nutrition, for longer-term exposures. If you're trying to look at something that causes cancer or requires a long-term pattern of exposure, most agencies use a per capita number. FDA uses the 90th percentile when they look at food additives and contaminants that they're more concerned about from a short-term exposure. So, there's not a right number here. It's kind of the key piece, I think, is to match our exposure assessment to the toxicology, the toxicity profile of the compounds we're interested in. And so I probably turn that back to Bruce and others to guide us a little bit there. One thing I will say, one of the limitations of the NHANES study is that they no longer release regional data, so we cannot identify Californians separate from the total population. We used to be able to do that sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s. They realized that they had budget cuts and smaller numbers of individuals, and they felt they were starting to release too much private information in a public format. So they no longer do that. Now, with all that suspense, let's go to the last slide, or to slide 6. These are the results for the foods that I've analyzed so far. And I did it for 5 different foods. Again, just trying to give you an idea of what the data look like. There's nothing magic about these foods. Some of them I know that we will have contaminant or chemical data for. Carrots I thought I had seen last year, but maybe we don't actually have any data on carrots. So working across, the first are the number of people. Remember I told you we had just over 15,000 respondents to the survey, and of those 15,000, 1,375 reported consuming almonds or a product containing almonds during the 2 days they were surveyed, or about 11% of the population. And I won't go through and read these all off, but you can see if you look at the per capita versus the per user, that the mean 1.4, but on a per capita basis, you're adding in so many people who don't consume it, that it doesn't really go up in the case of almonds. In the case of the per user, you've got at the 90th percentile a little over a gram per day of almonds when people eat them. So I like to look at them this way. That makes sense to me, that would be there. Citrus, the per user number is almost half a pound at the 90th percentile. So it's harder to put a framework on the grams per kilogram to know whether these are reasonable with how you know that people eat things. So I think the grams per day are a useful metric for that. The grams per kilogram, however, are usually the better metric to compare it to your toxicology data that's usually derived from animal studies and expressed on a grams per kilogram body weight per day basis. The last slide, slide 7, are just the references. If anybody wants to work directly with these surveys themselves, all of the data are publicly available, and these are the references and some background information on the various components of the surveys. So as that is a quick brush through, maybe I'll just stop talking and let the panel members
All right, let me
talk about it.
let me go first really quickly on a point of order to staff. I don't think we have this on the website yet, but we can by the end of the day today. Or when? By tomorrow. So for members of the public, we'll have this presentation on the website by tomorrow. So
can you be sure you label it draft, because this is very much a draft document.
Okay. And it is noted as such in your footer as well, obviously.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, panel members. So opening the floor in terms of what you might want to do with this data. Gabrielle?
These are just points of clarification.
You may need to get closer to the mic, sorry.
Can you go back
Sure.
one slide? So Barbara, just one quick question, just for almonds, for the per capita, why at the 90 percentile do we go down in grams per day versus mean?
Yeah, you're gonna need to get
Excuse me.
closer. I'm sorry, Gabrielle.
So just for the almond.
I can hear her question, and I've actually gone back to do another look at that, and to try to understand why. I assume it's that we had a lot of people, that we have some foods in there that have a very small amount of almonds, and those are eaten a lot. But I haven't looked at it, and I will do that. I should have done it before today, but I didn't.
And then can you give a bit of a background as to the choice of the 90th percentile? Because I know in other risk assessments, the percentiles becomes a point of argument. So can you give us a little bit of background of how that's the percentile chosen?
It was completely arbitrary, except these are the values that FDA uses when it looks at contaminants, and not even contaminants, because a lot of times they just use the mean for it, but for food additives and sort of pre-market approvals, they use a 90th percentile as the upper limit. And I have seen it some for EPA too, but it's completely arbitrary. I think once you get above the 90th percentile, in a database like these, you start to see a lot of variability, which looks to me like bad reporting. Or, there's one guy in there that reported consuming 9 kilograms of steak on one day, things like that. So I think everybody tries to stay 90th and 95th percentile for the reliability of the data.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions, comments from the members? So in terms of, let me pose a question to the panel in terms of how Barbara framed this. Her thinking was that this was something that the panel may want to weigh in on with regards to future studies and implications of consumption, food consumption, since that's ultimately what you are addressing. Barbara, I'm going to actually look to you to sort of restate the way or ways in which you think this, by your own admission, draft presentation might inform next steps by the panel. So just go ahead and restate what some of your thinking was about what the panel might do next with this.
Okay, sort of from my perspective, if I have data on citrus and I have 10 chemicals identified as present and a level, I would multiply that times the consumption and compare it to some toxicology endpoints to see are we in a realm where there's really no issue, or are we in a realm where there might be a big issue? And I think that might come back to Gabrielle's question, that if we compare it to the 90th percentile and we're still below what would be calculated as an acceptable reference dose, then we don't have to worry about exactly what number we might want to use. If we're very close, we may want to think about it and look more at the toxicology data, so forth. So I would think the first round is a scoping project to see, do we have any compounds here that we really want to look at more carefully or not? And if so, what are they? And then you talk about what your methods are for proceeding.
Okay, so this basically provides an example of what could be done were we to have those target commodities that the panel is getting concerned about based upon constituents that are identified in the samples. Bruce?
Yeah, Bruce Mackler. I do appreciate Barbara taking the effort to put this table together, and I have to concur that there is that error there. It appears to be an error on that almond 90th percentile on the per capita. That doesn't look right. But we have to have this kind of information in order to do a risk assessment. And you always have to have exposure, and this is a first shot, and the numbers are credible looking. We'll have to, as it moves from draft to a little more certainty, we'll be able to trust them a little more. But even if they're order of magnitude, they'll be very helpful here, because the real issue is to see whether, as Barbara said, are we going to be in a world that we have to worry about any given contaminant or a group of contaminants, or whether the results are so far from where a reasonable person would think that there was risk that we could put those contaminants aside and look at some other things. So I think this is the right direction.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Other comments, panel members? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to look to staff as well, and Dr. Stringfellow, Science Advisor. Any questions or comments?
I had a small question, Barbara. This is Will Stringfellow. I was curious about the 15,000 number. If I understood you correctly, you're going through the data, trying to get 15,000 units of information to do the stats with. Is that a standard for this kind of analysis, or what makes 15,000 the number you were targeting?
It's kind of a rule of thumb for me, because, and all of these foods are consumed often enough that I think we probably could have done with fewer. Sometimes if you have a food that's not eaten by many people, you need that many to end up with 100 users. And I like to never go below 100 users. Again, completely arbitrary. You balance the number of individuals with the age of the survey, and have dietary practices changed? So you could say, okay, I could do 30,000 people, but then I've gone back another 6 years, and the food patterns have perhaps changed, or especially if you're trying to look at new foods, or the impact of gluten-free on diets, various things. So it's pretty arbitrary, but in general, I think that will give us enough individuals and be current, sufficiently current to do the work we want to do.
Thanks.
Staff, leadership, any questions? Okay, seeing none and hearing none, we're going to go ahead and open up the floor for public comment. Let me first check in with Rebecca. Any comments emailed in at this time? Nope. Okay, so members of the public, if anybody would like to pose a question, please feel free to come up to the microphone. I'll double check right now to make sure that it's on. Okay, there are no members of the public that are interested in making comments or posing questions at this time. Therefore, we are going to thank you very much, Barbara, for your work on this and setting the stage for future activities. So with this, we are going to then move on to item number 4, which is the 2017 crop sampling results and the 2018 sampling. So what we're going to be covering in this section is a couple things. We'll get an update from staff on the citrus sampling that took place in March, and then we're going to move on to the process that has been Clay is mouthing things. Oh, it's written differently on my notes. Okay, sorry. All right, never mind.
That's what I was going to ask, Dave, are we going to talk about the MOU?
Yeah, we are. That's actually what I was going to actually say next. It's just the header was written differently on my my facilitation plan than on the agenda, so that was my fault. Okay, so we're going to move on then to a presentation by the consultant that's been selected for the MOU tasks, which is Dr. Robert Schofield, who is here from GSI Environmental Inc. Prior to that, I'm going to actually look to staff to talk about the implementation, if you will, of the MOU, the role that, as we've talked about this many times, the role that the regional board plays, and in a negotiated agreement, and the role that the regional board would play in terms of reviewing applicants to do the works, the selection process that was made to identify the consultant, and then we'll go from Clay to Dr. Schofield to give his presentation. So, Clay?
Okay, thanks again. Clay Rogers, Assistant Executive Officer of the Water Board. But You know, first of all, as the panel knows, we've been working diligently over the past number of months to get a memorandum of understanding between the irrigators and the water boards in place to cover the sampling and analysis of the fruit, nuts, and agricultural products that are grown with produced water, to have that work done, and also to have the literature review and the toxicological assessment of the chemicals being used performed. And so after finally getting that in place, Dr. Schofield and GSI consultants, a team, were presented to us as a potential consultant to do this work. This work is being paid for by the irrigators, but it's being technically overseen and directed by the water boards with input from Dr. Stringfellow, and also will have impact and input from the panel. And so we reviewed the management at the water board reviewed this. We were under a very tight time schedule because a lot of time had gotten away from us. We needed to do the citrus sampling before the citrus harvest was completed. And so we went through our criteria in reviewing the package on Dr. Schofield and GSI, which basically included, based upon his qualifications, did he appear to be qualified to do the work? And then based upon what we know, did there appear to be a bias that would be unacceptable? With appearing that Dr. Schofield is well qualified to do this type of work, and the fact that we did not see any bias, the water boards went ahead and approved the use of Dr. Schofield and his team to do this work. There had been an earlier potential applicant that had been discussed among the parties and was withdrawn. I'll add that, but Dr. Schofield was the successful party. And so he has been involved in the citrus sampling, the analysis. I've met with him, my staff's met with him to discuss the project, along with Dr. Stringfellow. And we asked that Dr. Schofield come in front of you today to talk about himself, his qualifications, a little bit about the project and how we plan on moving forward, and see if you have any questions and where we go from here. So with that, I'll introduce Dr. Robert Schofield from GSI Consultants, and I'll let him brag about himself a little bit.
Okay, can I, and then how do I forward just the right, this? All right, got it, thank you. Well, thank you. I would say that I recognized, when I was first contacted about this, that this is a very important project. And then as I looked through it, I also realized it's really interesting stuff, the science of it. So I'm really happy to be here on both counts. I'm really, and I feel very honored to have been selected to do this. And I'm just starting to work on this now. So what I'll mostly do is just take a few minutes and introduce myself, the team that'll be working on it. I've got a couple of slides that show the 3 tasks of the MOU that you all probably know better than I do. But if there's some discussion or points, that'll be a point of departure for questions, and I can show you what I understand the objectives, excuse me, of each of those tasks to be. So this won't take very long. So the company that I work for is called GSI Environmental. I've been working for them for only about 3 years, but I've worked with them side by side with them for probably 20 years. It's an engineering and science consulting firm. They have an R&D component. We do a lot of work, particularly for the Department of Defense, on environmental issues, developed a lot of software on bioremediation, on risk-based corrective action for petroleum, hydrocarbons, and have a fair number of research, what are really research projects, and software development. It's about 100 people in the company overall. Houston is the main office. There's also a smaller office in Austin. And then in the last few years, they opened one in Irvine. And then they called me a few years ago and said, we're going to open one in Northern California. And I said, I'm in. I really like the company, and this will be a fun thing to do on my way out as I retire. So we're starting a company. There's about 10 of us in Oakland. There's about 20 in Irvine. Okay, so me, I'm a principal at the company. I've been doing consulting, I can't believe it, but for 39 years. I started in 1979. And so some of the relevant projects are, I was a co-author of the ASTM Rebecca standard, and after which is risk-based corrective action. So it was a risk-based approach to cleaning up petroleum sites. And once we got that developed for ASTM, and EPA was a big sponsor of that, they started a program, EPA, and then along with the American Petroleum Institute, to provide technical support to states. So I went around the country and did training programs for, I probably went to about 12 or 15 states, and we did how to do risk-based corrective action and developed and provided technical support as they developed their training. I was on the National Academy Committee on, excuse me, on natural attenuation for groundwater. And recently, I served as a neutral technical expert. So I was assigned by a judge in a litigation involving San Francisco Herring Association versus PG&E about hydrocarbons and oil waste in the San Francisco Bay. And I was just dealing with the technical issues on the issue, and I was selected by both sides to be this neutral technical expert. Currently, I'm working with a group called Interstate Technology and Research Committee, which is mostly state regulators, and we're developing a guidance document for TPH to help states come up with their petroleum or their total petroleum hydrocarbon cleanups. And I'm coordinating the chapter on human health. And then I've done a lot of other projects, but those are, I think, some of the more relevant ones. I have done a lot of work on food safety. I do a lot of product safety and a lot of environmental, just general environmental, air toxics, water. I went to UCLA for maybe too long. I did my excuse me, my bachelor's, master's, and I went to the doctoral environmental science and engineering program there. And then I really liked and emphasized toxicology, epidemiology, so I ended up doing a postdoc at Davis, because they had, at that time, they had a very strong tox program, and I was funded by the Department of Defense to help develop drinking water standards for a new portable reverse osmosis unit that they were developing, should they ever get involved in a war in the Middle East. So I did that for 3 years, and then I went into consulting. So the scope of work, there's 3 tasks, and I'm under contract to do the 3rd task, and we actually went out and helped do some of the sampling. And then task 1 and task 2, I've been asked to provide a cost and budget for a scope of work. And as you probably know, task 1 is selection of chemicals for further evaluation. So, and in the MOU, the objective is listed as identifying, create a list of chemicals for further evaluation. And I think the big update to that is to add in the oil field contaminants. So I understand that there was a request made to the various oil companies, and they provided, I've got like a 6-page list of chemicals that are used in oil fields. So, we'd look through that preliminarily. There's a lot of organics, there's a lot of inorganics, and so we'll look to see which of those chemicals have not been looked at before and might need to be added as we collect more samples. And I think probably the key to that task is coming up with what is going to be the criteria for prioritization. How are we going to decide which ones we really want to focus our energy on? And I know it's going to be difficult because you put down all the standard criteria that you would like, and I know there's going to be big gaps. So some of the chemicals will say, okay, here's an organic chemical. What do I know about the toxicity of it? Should this be high or low priority? And I might not know. What do I know about its fate in plant uptake? What do I know about its fate in soil, et cetera? So I know there's going to be some gaps. So this isn't going to be a trivial task. We're going to have some gaps. And I'm very grateful that there's a lot of other people who will be looking over my shoulder on this to provide some technical knowledge and some input. The second one is to go through and do a really detailed literature search, and this topic was very wide-ranging. But when I looked at it, I thought, well, the common element of what we're looking for, what do we know about these chemicals that might affect human health risk and our ability to evaluate fate and transport, and can we analyze for all of these? It's going to be, we know that some of these we don't have standard analytical methods for. So that's the nub of each of those two tasks. And then the third one, I say we went out to the initial sampling of citrus, and the objectives in the MOU are to collect the samples, deliver them to the lab, review the results, and provide a written report. And I assume that somewhere in there, in that reviewing the results, and I've already tried to do some back-of-the-envelope calculations to say, well, using information like Barbara just talked about, is to say, well, so what if I have 2 parts per million of barium in an almond? Does that matter? Is that close? Is it not close? So I think that will be one of the key issues. And barium, luckily, is easy. Some of those organics, I think, will be where we really have to scratch our head. Okay, so I put the team down because I realized I wanted this to follow what we said was the scope. So I'm going to be the principal in charge. So it's my neck sticking out here. Tina Wong is in my office in Oakland. She's probably 2 years out of her master's at Berkeley. I think she's going to be doing a lot of the work on this. She's the one who went out in the field and observed. Oh, yeah, thanks. That's great. She's the one that went out in the field and observed the sampling and learned that one of the field hazards of sampling citrus is lemon trees have thorns. So Bernie Beckerman is also working with me. He kind of worked and did his PhD, so it's kind of hard to say how many years of experience he really has. I'll say 6 or 7 years. He did his PhD at Berkeley. He's been working with me on several projects, and I suspect he's going to be doing a lot of these working with me on some of these really more challenging issues of like, what are our criteria? Where are we going to get the data? How are we going to fill in the gaps? What assumptions are we going to make? Ileana Rhodes is on our team, and she's already been very helpful. She recently retired from Shell, and she has been developing analytical methods for all of the chemicals on that list of chemicals that are in the oil field use. And she knows some of them, and she knows some of them are difficult. So she will be just an incredible resource for us. And Elaine Guy has a master's degree and a lot of years of experience. She's really our go-to person for doing the literature search. She knows all the databases, how to search them, access to the information. And there's lots of other people in our company who've done a lot of work on produced water. We actually have a lot of experience with that, particularly with the Texas folks. To what degree I'll need to bring them in, I don't really know for sure yet, but I see that as the core team based on what I know about the scope now. And I will say that, because I know the issue of being objective is really important, we'll say that I'm very old school in the approach that environmental consultants and scientists need to take to issues like this. And by old school, I mean when I went through graduate school, we were always taught, you evaluate the scientific criteria, identify those uncertainties, and you leave the balancing of the political and management issues to people who have the right to do that. And that, as you all, I'm sure, are well aware, was really codified or put into the National Academy of Science Red Book on separating risk assessment from risk management. And I'm a very strong believer in that. So I take great pains to say, here's the science, here's the data, here's the uncertainties, here's the assumptions I had to make to be able to make a recommendation, and put it out there for everybody to look at. And I realize that in particularly with projects like this, where there's going to be some people who really want to use the water and might favor one decision over there's people who really want to keep chemicals out of the food supply and might separate, you might have a whole different view on it. I realize there's going to be that kind of a different views that people bring to this, and this is going to be, there will be trade-offs, and I'm very mindful of that, and I'm very mindful of the fact that it's not my decision to make that balance. And so I will put it up for everybody to look at, and that's my primary job. I'm responsible for the analysis, not the result. And with that, I'll open it to questions.
Oops. Okay, thank you very much. Let me, again, as I've committed, I'll be checking with Barbara periodically. So Barbara, I'll just check in with you first. Do you have any comments or questions you want to pose? Barbara, you may be on mute, or you may not.
No,
Okay.
yeah, I was on mute. Sorry.
All right.
No, I don't have any questions.
Okay, very good. Let me
Hi,
look,
Rob.
let me look to the panel. Comments, questions? No? All right. Leadership, staff. Wait. Oh, Gabrielle, go ahead. Sorry.
And this question may not be for Rob, it may actually be for Clay. So just coming back to the task 1 and task 2, just can someone explain the process to me right now? What's the plan?
Rob, could you go ahead and advance on your slide, just back to that slide that shows the tasks? There we go.
Well, certainly what I have asked the irrigators to do is that we need to get the agreement in place to get that work done, because that work is critical as we move forward. To some extent, it hasn't been as critical up till now as it is at this point. And the reason I say that, and I'll get a little bit ahead of myself, is that, as we talked about in January, we issued a lot of technical information orders to suppliers of oil field chemicals, to the companies that are producing the water that's used for irrigation. And with new legislation that was signed by the governor and in place and effective January 1, we now have the ability to collect trade secreted information, so that we believe we now have a pathway to know all of the chemicals that are being supplied. We just a couple days ago, and I'm looking at my staff, they will correct me if I'm wrong, but we posted on the website a list of 240 some odd.
60, a little more than 260.
Okay, a little bit more than 260 chemicals that are being used by at least one of the companies producing the water. So we now have the list of chemicals almost complete, and I'll clarify that in a minute, to be assessed and go through this process. So before we had that list, we could do the ones that we've detected in the water or the fruit, but we still have all these other chemicals that we were not completely aware were there. It's taken us a little bit longer to get that list together than I had hoped, for a couple reasons. One, we found out that when we talked to Company A, who was supplying a product to, oil company B that was producing the water, that he didn't know all of the trade secreted information, because he had a supplier to him that they were incorporating into their product that had a trade secreted concoction, for lack of a better term. And so we then had to send an order after we got that information. We had to send an order to that other supplier to get that information. We're now down in a couple instances. We have a couple more that the orders have either just gone out or on the verge of going out because we've had to make that particular step 3 or 4 times as we stretch down from the suppliers to the different suppliers. But we think we're hopeful that we have all of it. And then we've also worked hard with our legal staff and the major supplier so that we could put a list together that we could share with the public and not have to keep that, not to tell you that somebody has to test for something. But we have put the list up. We put it in a form that it does not contain trade secreted information that we would have to keep confidential. So we have all those compounds. What I can't tell you is exactly who's using that, what compound, or what product those compounds go to, or what the mass of that compound is that's being used. We've taken the approach that, if there's a drop of it going in somewhere, it still needs to be looked at. And as I said, we wanted to get this so it wasn't trade secreted, so we could share all of the information with the panel and with the public, so that everybody could see that list. And that list just went up. But now with that, we need to move forward and get the literature review done and get basically the toxicological assessment performed. So I've been working with the administrator, David Ansolbaher, who you may hear from at some point today, from Coelho Water District, to make sure that those agreements are in place so that that work proceeds and we get that work done. It's waited longer than we all want it to be done. Plus, we're in the process, we're actually holding some of the citrus samples, and we're hopeful that, we can analyze the citrus samples that were collected about a month ago now, that we can actually analyze them for that list of compounds, assuming we have analytical methods available to us to do that.
Seth?
Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing what you produce and working with you. And I actually did my PhD with Bernie Beckerman, and he's great.
Oh.
So, a question about some of the chemical information. It sort of, I think, will go in, question to you, but I think it holds some implications for what you guys are going to do in task 1 and probably task 2 and 3, actually. So, I want to commend the board for doing what seems to be a pretty heroic effort, getting all of these chemical data from multiple suppliers. I just played with the list a little bit last night and found that there are about 55% of the compounds that were disclosed via AB 1328 were not disclosed, at least with CAS-RN, in the 13267 orders that were issued in 2016 that Will and our colleague and I analyzed in our white paper. This, to me, sort of begs the question of, first, what is the exact time frame that the AB 1328 data were produced for and from? And is it different? Is it a different time frame than the 13267 disclosures? And also, and this I think is where it ties into what you guys are going to be doing. This suggests also that, unsurprisingly, if you work in the oil and gas space, oil fields are dynamic in nature. There's certain processes that occur sometimes and not others. price of oil and gas goes up and down, holds implications for how much is coming out of the ground. How is the work that you're going to do going to maybe, hopefully, take into account this dynamism, and that the chemicals that may be used in the following 2 years might be different than these 2 years? So sort of, I mean, I think there's probably going to be an interplay between continual disclosure and continual update, but I'm just sort of curious on how that's going to play out.
Well, I'll weigh in on that first. The first thing is, I believe, and again, I'll look to my staff, that the 13267 orders asked for complete listing going back 2 years. So it's a little bit of an overlap with the previous 13267 orders, but not complete. Also, from this point going forward, under waste discharge requirements and monitoring and reporting programs, the products being used have to be reported to us, periodically. We're getting data for every year as we go forward. And certainly, particularly for where irrigation's being done, we'll be looking to see if there's any new products that are being added to the list. And if that's the case, we will be issuing, or at least it's my intent that we'll be issuing those orders to find out if there's any new chemicals that are being used. And if we find out that new chemicals are being used that are, we will be asking those questions of, is it an issue and is it something that needs to be looked at? But we'll have to take those issues, as new products are developed, if new compounds are used, it's a question that will have to be addressed as we move forward.
And I'll add to it, as I wrote down a note, that as we do our literature search, I think in response to your comment, we should be looking for other chemicals that are used in similar activities, for similar functions that ours are used, that we could look for. And then also, when we, I think it's, Will and I were talking yesterday, day before yesterday, about most of the organics, I think, are probably what we're concerned with. We were talking about looking for what are called TICs, tentatively identified compounds. And so I think when we, as the labs run, we would be looking for TICs that show, if it's not a target analyte, we would be looking for, do we have something in the chromatogram that we weren't expecting to see that might say somebody's using something we weren't expecting to see. So I think those are two ways that spring to mind.
So that would be sort of like a time of flight or GC mass spec look, or, I mean, I don't know if you can you do that for fruit samples? I know you can do it for water.
Fruits, I need to talk to the analytical labs, because I know whenever, and I've done this several times before, but whenever we're analyzing fruit, it's a different world than analyzing water. There's just so many interferences. And so, I will ask the chemist, is this something that we could be looking for in the chromatograms? I don't know what, if it's just standard GC mass spec for most of these organics that we're looking for, or if we're going to have to do something really fancy. Yeah, those are good points. Thank you.
Let's, Alex, you got that as an action item, right? Okay, let's go ahead and repeat. I just want to make sure we have that as an action item for what you'll be checking on with the labs then. Just go ahead and restate.
I would be checking with the labs to see what analytical methods are they using, and is it technically feasible to be looking for what we TICs, T-I-C-S, tentatively identified compounds,
right,
that would indicate there's chemicals other than our target analytes in there.
Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments from the panel in the room? Staff, leadership? Dr. Stringfellow?
I just want to assure the panel that I'm going to work with GSI and make sure we're not reinventing the wheel, because there's a lot of information we already have, and then linking what work's already been done with what they're planning to do.
All right, let's go ahead and open up the floor for public comment. We will move on then to the update on sampling, but before we do that, let's open up the floor for public comment. Go ahead, Keith. And as you come up, I'm sure Keith already knows the drill, but do please identify yourself, your name, and if you represent an organization, just so people online can know who's speaking. Thank you.
Keith Knock.
Oh, I thought it was-
Keith Nakatani, Clean Water Action. So regarding the comment that Seth made about his checking of the list that was just made available, and 55% of them didn't have CAS numbers, was there an answer provided to how that's going to be addressed? Because my understanding is that those numbers are really critical in doing risk assessments.
Seth, did you want to weigh in first, or?
Yeah, just a point of clarification. So 55% of the new batch of chemical disclosures from AB 1328 that I guess were posted a couple of days ago, 55% of those compounds were not identified by with CAS-RN in the last round of the 13267 order disclosures. So, the AB 1328 disclosure has 94% of those compounds have CAS-RN. So I think that's a major improvement from the last the last round, where let's see, only 60% of the chemicals disclosed the last time had a corresponding CAS-RN. So yeah, I mean, there are definitely a few compounds that don't have CAS-RNs this round, but which should be rectified. But it's much better than last time.
So overall, would you say that you're satisfied with the situation as it is now with CAS numbers?
I would like to have 100% of the compounds have CAS-RNs. I think a couple of them have what look to be like product names with letters in the CAS-RN category, which obviously is not a CAS-RN. So I would say I'm pretty satisfied. I think if there was any room for improvement in this round of disclosure, I would say, and I understand from conversations with the water board that it would be hard to deal with some of the trade secret issues, to get information on mass used and frequency of use, which frankly is some of the most important information. But
Let me add one thing here too. Those compounds, I mean, this is a little bit of work in progress. We've been working to get the list as absolutely complete as we could, but it's still a little bit of a work in progress. The orders that we sent required the submittal of CAS-RN numbers. So where those orders are incomplete, they're in violation, and we will take steps to get CAS-RN numbers for all of the compounds listed from the suppliers. It's just that that takes just a little bit of time, Keith. So I didn't want to continually hold out, because it's critical that we take what we know now and apply it to the sampling that's being done. So it is a little bit of a work in progress, and we're getting there, but you'll have to give us just a little bit of time.
Keith, before you proceed with any follow-on, I know that Gabrielle and Bruce look like they wanted to get into the queue or respond. So go ahead, Gabrielle, and then Bruce.
This is just, and this may be more to Seth, but I have to admit I was surprised to see almond hulls, walnut shells, soybean oil. We're looking for new homes for almond shells with valuable uses. So do things like that get these kinds of numbers?
I would assume that an almond hull is not a chemical in and of
Right.
itself. So no.
Okay, so I just want to check when we say 100% that there are some things on that list that for other reasons wouldn't necessarily have a number. Okay.
Yeah, and let me clarify. for something like almond hulls where it's being used for loss prevention during drilling of a well, or walnut shells that are being used as a filter media in some of the water treatment that's done. You know, if we don't have CAS-RN numbers, then we can't supply them. But where we find that the information is incomplete and we have a chemical compound that doesn't have the required information, we will take the steps to get the required information.
Bruce?
I was going to say very much what Gabrielle was saying, that you have some oddities like wood dust on here that we're not going to see them. And so that expectation is, you know, unreasonable. And I also think that such things, we should put a little star by that they're not likely to be an issue here in terms of toxicity to citrus fruit or almonds or such. Because, I mean, at a certain point, you're going to have to just, you know, just work with what you have. We could fuss over this list until forever. But at a certain point, it's useful to take a look at this list and then start eliminating all the ones that we know don't have any real risk, or it's not plausible to think that you're going to have an issue there, and get down the ones that we really ought to get on top of.
Other public comment or question? Okay, hearing none and seeing none. Thank you very much, Dr. Schofield.
Thank you.
We will move on. By the way, I don't think we had a copy of the constituent list, but I have a personal copy here. So if folks haven't seen it online, if anybody wants to take a look at it, I'll put it over there on the table, and you can just pass it around if you want. All right, let's move on then to Clay. You're leaving? No. Okay. That would be the correct answer. Thank you. So we're going to move on then to a discussion of the fruit sampling activities that recently took place and an update on the sampling schedule. So will we start with you, Clay, or go straight to Steph? Okay. Rebecca? You're probably going to need to move the mic in pretty close. Or yeah, if you want to come up. Either way.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Rebecca Asami. I'm staff of the board. So just to give an update of some of our sampling efforts. In 2017, board staff observed a third-party sampling team, and we watched them take samples of crops from both treated and control sites. The samples were relinquished to board staff and submitted to WEC labs under chain of custody. Results from those sampling events were discussed in previous meetings. The board science advisor has put together reports from those sampling events, and those reports are currently being reviewed. They will be shared with the panel and posted to the Central Valley Water Board's food safety webpage. In March of this year, sampling has already begun. Staff accompanied the third-party sampling team to look at citrus samples and to take citrus samples from both treated and control sites. Staff watched mandarins, lemons, and navel oranges be sampled. Samples were taken by the third-party sampling team and then relinquished to board staff, and then submitted to WEC Labs under chain of custody. WEC Labs is currently in the process of analyzing the samples. During the sampling event, extra samples were taken from each site. This was done to ensure that enough sample would be available for potential additional analysis needed to cover constituents from additives. As Clay discussed earlier, under 13267 orders sent to dischargers and suppliers, information on additives, including constituents and CASRNs, have been reported to the board. To date, board staff has written approximately 30 orders, and we are still receiving submittals but have collected the majority of the information, at least we think so. Going forward, it is anticipated that more sampling will be conducted in 2018. The sampling will probably occur in late summer or early fall, at least that's when it occurred last year, and should include pistachios, almonds, garlic, and grapes. Sampling and analysis plans for sampling events will be posted to the webpage. In addition, board staff has been working to finalize our field notes from all of the sampling events. and those will be posted to the webpage as well. Thank you.
I just want to add, as Gabrielle mentioned, not Gabrielle, but Barbara mentioned, there were carrots on her list. One of the things we'll be looking at is a list of all the commodities that are being grown this year. And are there any row crops like carrots, potatoes, or something else that would be of particular concern that if there is a field of that crop being grown, we want to make sure that we get a sample of that particular crop and get it analyzed, even if it's only a few acres. So we will be looking at that as we go forward.
So questions from the panel? Barbara, I'll check in first with you to see if there's any questions you have online, on the phone. Barbara, also be sure to check your mute. Any questions you have?
No, no questions from me right now.
All right, we'll go to the panel in the room. Any questions or comments? Do we have or maybe you just covered it, the update on when the final, the individual sampling activity reports are going to be done?
I can answer
Okay.
that.
All right.
Hopefully we'll have a few minutes right after this meeting, because I was up till 2 o'clock this morning reading sampling reports, so I have some comments. As soon as we get that done, then we'll be submitting it to the panel for their comments, and then after that, we'll also be submitting it to the irrigators to give them a heads up. And then as soon as we address the panel's comments, it'll be out for public comment and posted to our website.
Any rough window of time that you want to put into this that we would be aiming for?
I'd like to say that, maybe in less than a week, we would have copies that would be going to the panel. Depending upon how long it takes, assuming we give a couple weeks for the panel to respond. Hopefully there's not too significant of a comments that take much time. My hope would be is that we have them up on the website in less than a month.
Okay, very good. Any other questions from the panel or staff too, Rebecca? Let me check in. I don't want to put you on the spot, Dave Ansola here, but is there anything that you would want to report from the district's perspective having to do with the sampling activities or the MOU? Anything? No? Okay. All right, good. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor for public comment. Anybody wish to come forward and ask any questions or pose any comments? Hearing none and seeing none. We'll check in with Rebecca. We have a comment online. Go ahead.
So this comment comes from Laura Hayter. I think the carrot consumption will increase because doctors of integrative medicine and functional medicine and nutritionists claim that Americans are not eating enough vegetables for optimum health. Grain intake, especially allergenic wheat and corn, both with glyphosate herbicide, are instructed to be reduced. Many have magnesium deficiency that can be corrected by vegetables. References will be sent later. Nuts were claimed to be healthier sources of oil than processed soybean oil, canola oil, and cottonseed oil. Rice was found to be high in arsenic and rice protein high in lead, especially from China. A new protein source is needed, such as nuts.
Thank you, Rebecca. And as always with comments that are sent in online, we'll take that verbatim and we'll go ahead and include it into the meeting summary. So rest assured that will be included verbatim. All right, moving ahead, just one last check with the public. Any other comments or questions? Okay, hearing none and seeing none. Let's see where we're at on our agenda. Let's then move on to just a general update on the food safety project. In particular, there's been discussion recently about soil type analyses. So we're going to be looking to you here, Clay.
Yeah, I'll let Josh make a brief discussion. I think when we spoke with the panel last time, we said we were starting to look at, or at least a comparison of the results that we have from the fruit and nuts with different soil types. So we're still in the process of doing that, but thought we'd let you know a little bit of what we're doing and see if you have any thoughts or suggestions, if you'd like to see something a little different, or we're always looking for better ways to do things.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. Good morning, panel members. My name is Josh Mahoney, and I'm an engineer with the Central Valley Water Board. Today's presentation will discuss the concentration of inorganics in crops. I will start by going over the project background to identify the dates and crop sample results that will be discussed in this presentation. I will then go over the concentrations of inorganics for each crop sample type, historical concentrations of inorganics in produced wastewater, and show a map of crop sample results overlaying a soil map.
Josh, you may want to get slightly closer to the microphone or tilt it
okay.
up a bit. So.
All right, to give a little background, we touched base on this a little bit, but in 2017, Water Board staff observed a third-party sampling group collect samples of almonds, citrus, garlic, grapes, and pistachios. Sample locations consisted of two types, treated and control. Treated sites are irrigated with produced wastewater and include Kern Tulare Water District and Coelho Water District. Control sites are not irrigated with produced wastewater. This map shows the sample locations and service territory for Coelho Water District and Kern Tulare Water District. The red boundary represents Coelho, and the blue represents Kern Tulare. Crop sample locations are represented by the gray circles. Circles within the red and blue boundary lines are treated sites. Control sites are located outside of the red and blue boundaries. These sites were selected based on farmers that had land within and outside of the districts. These sites were selected to have similar farming practices at control and treated sites, while the major variable of change is the reuse of produced wastewater for irrigation. This is why some of the sampling locations are further north, south, and west of the irrigation districts than others. Crop samples that were collected in 2017 were shipped to WEC labs to be analyzed for metals, VOCs, and SVOCs. Metals displayed on the screen are the inorganic constituents that will be discussed further in this presentation. There we go. Metals were analyzed using Environmental Protection Agency methods 6020A and 6020B. As shown on the screen, constituents that are strike-through were reported to have all non-detect results for both control and treated sites. Constituents that are bolded and in orange had detectable concentrations in either control or treated sites. Constituents that are bolded will be examined further in the upcoming slides to identify potential trends in treated versus control sites and vice versa. The following figures were generated by Dr. Stringfellow, Science Advisor for the Water Board, and have also been presented in previous meetings to the panel. This is intended just to go over discussion of the inorganics and where we're seeing them in control versus treated sites. So these figures show a comparison of the concentration of barium based on the sample type. Looking at the figure for almonds, located in the top left-hand corner, the concentration is on the y-axis, and it's in milligrams per kilogram, and the type of site, control versus treated, is on the x-axis. In this figure, almond samples for treated sites, shown on the right-hand side, are higher by a statistical significance than the control samples shown on the left-hand side. Sample results for almonds, garlic, and pistachios at treated sites appear to be higher by statistical significance compared to control sites. Due to this, barium is considered a constituent of interest. This slide is for copper and has similar figures to the previous slide. From this slide, we can see that citrus and pistachios, shown in red, have elevated concentrations in control versus treated sites that are statistically significant. Looking at molybdenum, the concentration for control and treated sites appear to be approximately the same. For nickel, the concentration of garlic for control sites, shown in red, appears to be higher at a statistical significance when compared to treated sites. The remaining crop types appear to have approximately the same results for treated and control sites. For zinc, the concentration in pistachios appears to show high results in control versus treated sites.
That says strontium.
I think that's strontium.
Oh, sorry. Yep, I skipped one. Sorry for strontium. The concentration in citrus, garlic, and grapes appear to show higher results in treated versus control, as shown in red. Due to this, strontium is considered a constituent of interest since crop sample results for treated sites were higher than control sites. Now for zinc. Looking at zinc, the concentration in pistachios appears to show higher results in control versus treated sites. This is by a statistical significance, as shown in red. The other crop types do not appear to be statistically significant between control and treated sites. There we go. So to summarize the previous slides, copper, nickel, and zinc yielded higher concentrations in control sites, and this is by a statistical significance than treated sites. Next to each of these constituents is the maximum concentration observed for control and treated sites. Max sub C is the maximum concentration for control sites, and max sub T is the maximum concentration for treated sites. As shown for these constituents, the maximum concentration for all three is observed in control sites. The next section is for sites that have approximately the same concentration between control and treated sites. Molybdenum appears to be neutral, but has the maximum concentration at a control site. The last section is for constituents of interest that had elevated concentrations by statistical significance of barium and strontium in treated versus control sites. For barium, the highest concentration is observed at a treated site with a concentration of 2.1 milligrams per kilogram versus the control site with 1.9 milligrams per kilogram. For strontium, the highest concentration was observed at a control site with 11 milligrams per kilogram, and the treated maximum concentration is 9.5 milligrams per kilogram. As this slide and the previous slides have shown, the range of concentrations changes for each crop type as well as the site type. Sample results for treated sites are observed to be both higher and lower than control sites by a statistical difference for specific types of crops. Of the 5 constituents shown on this screen, barium and strontium are considered constituents of interest since the concentrations were elevated in treated versus control sites. Due to this, staff is looking at potential sources of barium and strontium that are likely to influence the fruit. Potential sources that could impact or contribute to the accumulation of inorganics in the fruit include the following: herbicides and pesticides, fertilizer or nutrient management, irrigation water, and the soil type. For the food safety project, staff is in the process of going through these sources that have the potential to influence the crop. As stated previously in this presentation, sample locations for control and treated sites were selected at farming areas that are owned by the same entity. Since the farmers are the same, farming practices are expected to be similar for control and treated sites. For this presentation, pesticides and nutrient management are not being considered as a significant source of consideration that may influence the crops. The quality of irrigation water for control and treated sites is being examined by staff. For treated sites, regular monitoring is conducted for produced wastewater and blended produced wastewater used downstream of Reservoir B and at other sites where irrigation water is being used with produced wastewater. These results will be discussed in the upcoming slides. Currently, staff is looking at water quality results of surface and groundwater that is used as blending water with produced wastewater. This is being looked at to see if there are any constituents that are being introduced to the system or are being elevated by the surface or groundwater results. The last item that staff is looking at for this presentation is the type of soil at each sampling location. The United States Department of Agriculture has published soil classifications for Kern County that will be discussed in the upcoming slides. Are there any questions before I continue? Oh, okay. This slide shows the water quality results for barium in produced wastewater, which is pre-blending, and irrigation water post-blending. There we go. Section 1A, marked on the left-hand side, shows the concentration of barium in irrigation water that has been blended and is provided to the farmers for use. Section 1B shows the concentration of produced wastewater pre-blending from each of the oil company's treatment facility. There we go. The maximum and minimum concentrations are observed on the right-hand side of each section. The highest concentration for barium was observed in the irrigation water for Coelho Water District at a concentration of 0.2 milligrams per liter. The drinking water MCL for barium is 1 milligram per liter. The highest concentration of barium does not exceed the MCL for drinking water. One item to note is that the maximum concentration was observed in irrigation water and not produced wastewater. This sample was collected in 1985 and is an outlier for irrigation water. Most recent sample results for irrigation water appear to yield results that are equal to or lower than produced wastewater. This slide shows the water quality for strontium and is in the same format as the previous table. The maximum concentrations for irrigation water and produced wastewater are shown on the right-hand side. For strontium, we can see that the highest concentration is from produced wastewater from California Resources Corporation at 1 milligram per liter. Strontium does not have an MCL for drinking water and is not compared at this time. This slide shows a map of the various soil types published by the United States Department of Agriculture with the crop sample locations for 2017. Each shape shown on the map represents a sample location with the crop sample results for barium and strontium. The shape represents the type of fruit, and the color depicts the range of the concentration. The inner circle are results for barium, and the outer circles are results for strontium. This slide and the next slide are intended to show the locations of high and low concentrations of barium and strontium. This map shows some of the sample results of treated sites located in Coelho Water District. This slide shows sample results for control sites. As briefly seen on these two maps, there does not appear to be an initial correlation of high or low sample results grouped together. Also, visually, there does not appear to be a correlation between the soil type and a high or low crop sample result. Staff went through and assigned soil types to each sample location to do a statistical analysis or comparison between the soil types and the crop sample results, but did not have enough data points of each crop type to make a correlation. Staff is waiting on sample results for 2018 prior to completing a statistical analysis that would look for correlations between high and low crop sample results based on the type of soil. In summary, water quality results of produced wastewater and blended produced wastewater for barium and strontium appear to be of good quality. Staff is obtaining water quality results for surface and groundwater results that may be blended with this irrigation water. This may be used to see if barium and strontium or other constituents are being increased by this surface or groundwater that is being used for blending. For the soil analysis, the goal is to generate a statistical comparison of crop sample results to the type of soil at each sample location. Part of this comparison will include the search for potential trends that may exist between elevated or reduced concentrations for a specific crop type. In addition, staff will also compare crop sample results from 2017 to 2018 for the same sample locations. Status of the soil analysis is currently on hold since there are not enough data points available to complete a statistical analysis. Once the 2018 sample results are available, staff may have enough data points to complete this analysis. This concludes my presentation. At this time, I'd like to open the floor for any questions from the panel. I would also appreciate any comments or feedback regarding future or additional work that you may be interested in.
I want to add one thing too, and that is as Josh mentioned, we don't have a lot of samples in any one soil type because we're dealing with a lot of different soil types. The soils are variable in Kern County. So we're looking at the 2018 data, but we're also going back and looking at the work that was done previous to, that was completed directly by Coelho prior to the regional board being involved in the field sampling, but work that they did. So we're going to be looking and doing some QA/QC on that, comparing those results with current results, and looking to see, basically data validation processes to see whether we should include that data as we look to get a little bit larger sample size if we want to try and do some statistical analysis. So that will be part of our future work, is also looking at the complete package of all the work that's been done, making sure that we have good data validation in place. And if the data look like they're valid, then we will also be using previous data collected by Coelho before because they started even before the panel was in place. They have been doing some volunteer work, and some of those locations are the same location as samples are being currently collected.
All right, let's open up the floor to the panel. Questions, comments? I'll start with the panel in the room first and then go to Barbara thereafter. Any comments or questions for Josh? Seth?
I missed the first probably 2 slides of your presentation, and you may have covered this, but the analyses that were marked as Dr. Stringfellow conducted this, are those the same data and results as the last meeting?
Correct.
Okay. So just to recap from the last meeting, I think that there are some compelling results here for certain compounds with respect to what was analyzed: barium, strontium, copper, zinc, etc. We should also remember that in some of these cases, in many of these cases, the sample size was around 3 or so, 3 to 5 pieces of fruit.
Yeah, that was particularly for garlic. And
Yeah,
for most of them, there's, somewhere between, say, 9 and 11.
Okay.
But that's part of what's plaguing trying to do any kind of soil analysis, because the questions, things like, can we pool the fruit together, for example? If we could pool some of these samples, like all the nuts together and all the grapes and the citrus together, but there's just not enough data right now we're still looking into it, but I think there are not enough samples to do that kind of, if that's the question.
So, I might suggest picking up a few more samples next time around, if possible.
Well, I think part of the issue, and I'll point this out for garlic, where the sample size is small, and Josh and Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there was only one field of garlic grown. It was a small field.
Correct.
So, it's not like we have 1,000 acres out there. So, I mean, some of that is why, we may not be able to rectify that. And I do not know, there may be no garlic grown in this area this coming year. The row crops are something that had been grown in the past, but are not as prevalent as they were in the past with the onset of a lot of the more permanent crops like pistachios and almonds.
And then lastly, not to beat a dead horse who is already dead, but I assume that there will be an expansion of the number of compounds that will be assessed next time around in various different ways, and that might feed into Dr. Schofield's assessment.
Correct, yeah.
Yes, that's the list of new constituents. We've sent that list to the lab to look to see if the samples that were just collected, what can we analyze for to get a more complete look at that. But the intent is to, use that list to get analyses, and the intent is that the 2018 samples are analyzed for everything that is of concern.
Any other question, Stephen?
Steve Beam, California Department of Food and Agriculture. So just to recap a bit, and you could help me. There was only barium and strontium that were identified as constituents of concern. Is that correct?
Constituents of interest, yes.
Constituents of interest. Okay. So, and you reported the highs and the lows in terms of the range. And can you remind me what the differences in the average or the means
Why don't you just
were?
go back to those slides?
Yeah.
Good.
Are you talking about for the fruit or for the water quality? So we got fruit sample results here, and we've got the water quality in the next slides.
The
Why don't
fruit, the actual
Yeah,
commodities.
Why don't you go back up to the slide that's the statistical analysis on the barium, for example?
It froze.
It froze.
Uh-oh.
There we go.
Okay, this slide?
No, well,
Yeah, those are showing the maxes, but I'm interested in the mean differences.
yeah.
Oh.
So go to barium or strontium if you want. So what's the,
So we didn't have, oh, whoops, in the
Did-
case of,
Barium?
barium's fine, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we had almonds, garlics, pistachios and the differences and the means were, they're not,
well, the green line across the middle is the mean.
right.
So, if you're looking at pistachio, you're looking at 0.45 versus 0.17 for, what is that, barium?
Okay. And what was the level of statistical significance on those?
These are, in all the cases where we said it was significant, it's 95%.
Okay. So I'm just interested in, it's interesting and good data. I'm just wondering about really how compelling it is. I don't know that such differences would have any physiological significance. That's the piece that's missing for me. It may be statistically different, but to me, I'm not so sure it rises to the level of being compelling yet. I think that was the term I heard Seth describe. I'm not so sure I see something compelling. It certainly may be of interest. I guess I appreciate the way you've categorized that data. But okay.
And let me add
Thank you.
one thing, Stephen, is that I think what Will looked at here was a comparison of control versus treated.
Yeah.
It's interesting to note that, some compounds are statistically higher in the control. Some are statistically higher in the treated. Some of the ones where we have statistically significant, I think if you look at the strontium, we have statistically significant increase in the treated over the control, but the highest concentration was in a control sample. So, some of this, we're not dealing with a large data set, so it makes the statistics a little bit of an issue. Which we're hopeful that, another round of sampling will help to answer that. But I also want to add, and Will can correct me, I'm reading a little bit out of his draft report since I spent some time last night, is that none of the concentrations that were measured were outside the norms for what we expect within the crops being consumed. There is nothing here that appears to be anomalously high for what we know about fruit and nuts being consumed. So even though they may be a statistically significant difference, and that will lead to the toxicological issue, at least at this point, it doesn't appear to be anything that would be an epidemiological or a physiological issue. that would indicate that there is a problem with the fruit or nuts. So, and maybe there's somebody who's a toxicologist, maybe Dr. Schofield wants to add something to that.
I couldn't help myself last night. I did look at the max detect in the almonds and looked up EPA, OEHA's reference exposure level, which they didn't have one. So I went to IRIS, looked at the reference dose, and a person would have to eat 7.5 kilos of almonds a day to get to the reference dose. So, because we were talking when we met in Fresno about, well, how much effort do we need to put into figuring out what these differences are, how important are they? And for the inorganics, it really didn't matter much. It'll be, I think, more interesting to look at the organics. But I just couldn't help myself. I wanted to, because I had the same question of, well, what realm are we in? So, based on one data point.
I also call that the so what factor. Is it matter? So, but I do want to point out that, I'm really happy to have this MOU going forward because there's a lot of background information I think we can get that putting things in context is very, very important. And from everything I've understood so far, different kinds of groundwater sources are going to have different concentrations of these minerals. And this, depending on what area of the country you are, what aquifer you're drawing from, it's going to have an effect. And then again, like we're looking at soils, if there are different sources of fertilizer, there's a lot of reasons why you might get differences between two different fields or two different areas. So, and then again, we need, as we're looking at, is, does any of this really rise to the level of any kind of concern about anything?
Thank you. Steve Beam again with CDFA. I totally agree and appreciate the follow-up comments on that, because as you stated, context with data released to the public is going to be crucial. Otherwise, high, low, all of that can be misunderstood. So I appreciate the follow-up. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from the panel?
This is Barbara.
Go ahead, Barbara.
I see those as very little variability, actually, in terms of what I'm used to seeing in food crops, especially something like garlic, where the extent of drying and the amount of moisture may make more difference than anything. So I think I'm seconding what everybody says. These look all the same to me. Can I come back to something I did a little bit earlier today?
Sure.
We had the question about the 90th percentile for almonds. So I pulled the data out while we were talking, and I thought people might be interested in what the difference is. And because I think it informs a little bit about whether we want to use the 90th percentile or the mean or something. And basically for almonds, what you see is very highly skewed consumption data. So when we took that population and calculated the per capita, it was actually at there was zero consumption per day at the 25th, the 50th, and the 75th percentile. At the 90th percentile, you got, I'll go slowly so if people want to write these down. At the 90th percentile, we got 1.2 grams per day. At the 95th, we got 6.5, and at the 99th, we got 34. So when you go back to calculate a mean and a 90th percentile, they do look odd on the per capita basis. But on the per user, you can actually calculate a valid 90th percentile.
Thank you, Barbara. Let me go ahead and open up the floor for public comment now. Any questions or comments at this time?
Keith Nakatani, Clean Water Action. Is there a reason for the small sample sizes? Is it funding related? And then the second part of the question is, what size of sampling would be more defendable? Because it sounds like the ones that have been sampled so far are perhaps a bit too small. Either for you or Clay, I would
Well,
think.
let me say one thing about I think, I'm not convinced that the sample size is too small, because if you see here, we are actually seeing differences between different areas. So that indicates there is some robustness into our ability to discern things between the different sites. Economics are always an issue with sampling because it is expensive prospect. And as a scientist, you can always collect more samples. But I guess the thing about the garlic is there's just not a lot of garlic out there. So, perhaps if we did garlic this year, we might want to sample more from the same field. I don't think the result's going to be different, but it would give us some greater ability to discern between the two samples. Right now, I wouldn't say that we're short on sample size. And I think there's one of the things that's being done is there's pretty comprehensive coverage of the different areas is driving a lot of this forward. So it's the number of fields planted and where access is being taken for the fields.
Your response may have already covered Keith's sort of secondary question about defensibility. Is there anything else you want to say to that?
Well, I guess I think we can look into, we've looked into this question more, but at this point, I'm not concerned that we're not getting enough sample. I'm really not. That hasn't risen to level of concern from my point of view, but I think we can do further analysis on that.
Okay. Dr. Longley, I saw you moving the mic. Was there something you were going to add to it?
Well, as I understand the garlic, the issue is you don't have the spatial variability. Without more fields of garlic, you can't get the spatial variability. But won't multiple years of sampling add to the robustness of the data?
Thank you for mentioning that, because I forgot to add, as we accumulate over this year, we'll be doubling sample sizes and pooling the data. So it will become more robust as it goes.
So is this all new work in the sense that this type of work has never been done, so there is no standard acceptable sample sizes? What you just said, Will, is that just based upon your personal assessment with all the data and all your previous experience? How does that work?
Well, I think my main argument for it right now is that we're seeing differences between the treat and controls areas, which suggests that we're in a good sample range so far. I think we should consider that question some more. There are protocols we looked at in terms of sampling that's done for pesticide, drift, and things like that, and we looked at those types of protocols.
So if the sampling sizes are to be increased, how much of a factor is funding? Maybe that's a question for Clay.
Can I say one more thing? Just the sample size, for example, I think in almonds there are 11 samples. They're doing, theoretically, they'll do another 11 this year. That means we're in the 22 range for replicates. So the sample size is increasing as we go.
Yeah, and then assuming that the data are valid, we have the previous ones too. But let me assure you, Keith, the role here is to make sure that we have technically sound and defensible data. It's the reason we've assembled the expert panel. We've hired the science advisor to advise us on this to make sure it's done. Funding is not the deciding factor here. The regional board will get the right answer, and go through the process. There's not some dollar limit that says, we stop here. The goal is to get the data needed to come up with the right answer.
Thanks for that clarification. One last question. Do members of the panel have any opinions on the sample size issue?
If you've taken a statistics class, you'll learn about N values and how many samples you need to actually have an appreciation for the uncertainty. And that's an important consideration to make sure that we have enough. I have to point out, though, that so far we don't have a smoke, at least with respect to the inorganics, we have no smoking gun. If the rough approximation of consumption and exposure is such that we're talking levels that would be orders of magnitude below the reference doses, and that I know personally the reference doses are set very conservatively. There isn't any, I'm not seeing anything that suggests that we need to do a whole lot more, at least with respect to the inorganics. I won't speak to the organics till I see it. But if we had seen big outliers here, then of course that comes back into the question, do we have enough samples? But at least for most of these, garlic perhaps accepted, I think we have enough that we have some certainty or some confidence in the ranges that we're looking at now, and those ranges are quite low relative to human health. So that's my take on it.
Thank you. So the last thing I'll say is that, so this is within the context of the small number of chemicals that have been tested, and there's the big question that we've discussed earlier today and in other meetings about what other chemicals of concern should be prioritized, and I know that you guys are going to be grappling with that, so things may change. Thank you.
Let me do a point of order. We're just slightly after noon, and we have one major content item left. Recognizing that there's always something that can come up in a final agenda item. Actually, Josh, were you completed in your presentation? Okay, all right. Just by a show of hands, I'm not holding anybody to it. Just at this point in time in the public, how many folks are aware that they would want to come forward at the end of the meeting and sort of the last sort of open session of public comment? Is anybody right now knowing that they would want to do public comment? Okay, so we have this one final item. I'm going to look to the panel to suggest, and we can not do this, but given that we're at noon, we have item number 7, which is the last content item, and then everything else is basically one more round of public comment. We would otherwise be doing a lunch break. I'm just kind of curious, perhaps we should do a bio break, as I would call it, just sort of let people stand, stretch, use the restroom, move straight on to the last content item, do one additional round of public comment, and then we would be completed with the meeting. Alternatively, we can do the plan as it was, which is we could go to a lunch break right now and then come back in, approximately an hour. So I'm going to look to the panel. Does the panel have any opinions as to which you would prefer? Would you prefer to do the longer lunch break or just take a brief break and just try to plug through and then be done a little bit earlier? Any thoughts one way or the other?
Dave,
Yep.
Dave, let me add that 15 minutes.
That's your presentation?
Yeah, maybe 10.
That of your presentation?
So unless we have a lot of people or a lot of discussion, we're pretty close.
Okay, so
Preference is to power through.
pardon? Power through?
Preference is power
Any member of the panel opposed to that? All right, well, let's do this just in deference to humans being humans. Let's go ahead and just do and I mean brief, 5-minute break. Okay, stand, stretch, use the restroom. We're going to do a 5-minute break. We're going to come back. We'll start up. Well, I'll give you 7 minutes. We'll just round it to 12:15. Okay, so we're going to go to 12:15 for stand and stretch. We will start sharply right at 12:15 for item number 7, and then continue on with final public comment. So folks online, we will resume right at 12:15. Don't flirt with disaster. All right, folks, let's go ahead and take our seats and get started again, please. If panel members could please take your seats. And science advisor, and panel member, and science advisor. Thank you. Yes. Oh, there. Okay, I'm sorry, Seth. It was panel members. Thank you. Gabrielle was blending into the crowd. All right, we are going to move on to item number 7, and then we'll open up the floor for panel comment and then public comment, and then we'll see where we're at.
So anyway, this will be brief, but Clay Rogers, I just wanted to talk a little bit because, again, you know, this year was not a very good water year, so there are some projects that are coming to the water boards. I just wanted to let the panel know about a couple projects. One's fairly large, one's pretty small. Okay? Anyway, the larger new project is one where the oil producer is E&B Natural Resources. The water district is Sherwood Hills Water District, and we've received an application for waste discharge requirements, or what we refer to as a report of waste discharge. And staff is working on waste discharge requirements that would go to consideration for the board either later this summer or this fall. So I'll give you just a couple. There is one critical difference in this project from others, and it's immediately east of Coelho Water District, on the very eastern edge of the agricultural areas. But they've got a couple phases. In their total phase, they would have about 4,500 acres of crops, citrus, grapes, nuts, pretty much the same crops as what we've seen, but also silage and grain crops. Proposed discharge is 9,400 acre feet of water at its maximum. So this is, it would be a 20–25% increase in the volume of water used for this activity. And you can see that the acreage is not as high. So the significant difference with this one is that the water quality is actually a little bit better coming out of here, with the boron being pretty low. And they're not proposing to blend wastewater with other sources of irrigation water. So this is different than what we have seen. Based upon the water quality, and I think we've got a slide to that here in just a second, I'll talk about that. Okay, that ain't gonna work. So here's where it is, and this area over here, and I'll take the cursor. This area over here is Coelho Water District, and this is where Reservoir B, that's where produced water goes into Coelho, is down here. And this is Highway 65 that runs between Bakersfield to the south and Porterville to the north. You can see the proposed farmland is on the east side of Highway 65. Some of it's new farmland, so this would be a water source for this new agricultural production. And you can see it's the McVan area of the Mount Poso oil field, which is in the white square. So here's a little bit of the water quality here, and we've compared, we put up a couple of other sources, one from Chevron, one from Valley Water Management. So this is water going to Coelho Water District. You can see its electrical conductivity is lower than the Chevron Valley Water. Chloride's lower. Boron's a little bit lower. Our water quality objectives of boron for agricultural use are 1 milligram per liter. Citrus can be pretty sensitive. The issue is that if they let the boron get out of control, they're going to have a boron toxicity issue on their crop. Isn't necessarily a human food safety issue, but it would be a toxicological issue for the agricultural land if they had boron toxicity. So most of our water quality objectives for boron are set on that. So we are in the process of getting more information from these folks, including chemicals being used by E&B there, so we see how this compares to other areas and what's there. It looks like a potentially viable project to us. I just wanted to let you know that we will be presenting updates on things like this and new things that are going on. And one of the questions I'll ask the panel, and whether you're prepared to answer that today or later, is how significant is the fact that they're not proposing to blend the water? Is that something that we're looking at? And should we do something different with this specific area as it comes into production than what we're doing with the cropland that's being used now, where it's being spread out over a much larger area and not used as intensely in one particular area? And then, yeah, we can go ahead. I can take a couple questions now, or we can comment on that project.
Well, you were asking us, so I thought that was the trigger to ask
No,
a question.
that's a good enough trigger, Andy. Sorry.
Well, do they have the technology and engineering like Chevron to treat this water before it goes to the fields? Because you're just showing 4 variables here. What about all the other constituents of concern?
Well, those are some of the issues we're looking at. Or what are the organic contents? How much of the oil's removed? What are the chemicals being used? And getting more complete water quality data about all the other constituents that are potentially in the water. So those are issues that we're looking at.
No,
I just don't have the answers yet.
And is this a new water district? I never heard of it before.
It's just a very small water district. It's Sherwood Ranch, I believe, is the name. It's relatively small. It's owned by one particular family.
I see. And is it already in agriculture production, or are they converting?
Not all of it. As you can see from that aerial photograph, Andy, that some of it is under agricultural production, but I believe it's proposing to expand some production. So it's in an area of very limited water resources. I mean,
prior to continuing questions, I just want to check. You're intending to come back to this in June. The board will be hearing this WDR in June. Is that right?
It will not be heard in June.
Not
no.
heard. Okay. All right.
No, and we have another public meeting in July. Certainly, I thought we would provide additional update in July. That meeting would be before any meeting where it would be brought in front of the board for consideration.
So thus the point of your question of what else the panel would want to know, which is
I don't know that, if we're not prepared to talk about that today, this is just kind of, it's there. But if you have comments and things you think we should consider or input you would like to provide, certainly we'd like to hear it.
Okay, so one question is the question about level or lack thereof of treatment before it's leaving the production site. Other questions that panel members would want to be researched, to be brought back for further information? Seth?
So, the quality of other groundwater that is blended at, say, Coelho or North Kern is, there's some information on it, not a lot. But the fact that, in, wetter, drier years, it's blended, 50 to 80%, I believe it is, in my mind, sort of hedges somewhat against a bunch of stuff that we may not be able to monitor for or have no really good toxicological information on. So I'm not quite sure how to answer the question of what should we really be thinking about, because I think a lot of that information needs to be collected, and there needs to be a very appropriate, meaning, you know, sensitive and informed monitoring approach, in addition to Andy's comments about questions around treatment, filtration, oil-water separation. Those are just some things that I would sort of pose as, you know, discussion points.
Thank you.
Other questions? Gabrielle? And then Barbara, I'll check in with you after Gabrielle.
This may be more academic, but I mean, it does sound like it is an opportunity, again, on a researchy side, for at how things change over time with this, you know, given that the land hasn't had this kind of water applied now, issue would be, if it goes into farming, you're making major changes no matter what. But I'm just saying there may be some opportunities here for some information to address some of these longer term questions that have come up. I'm not sure exactly how to make it not too onerous, but again, I think there is an opportunity.
No, we recognize that too, and when I say there's no dilution, I mean, you've got, if I go back up to the previous slide, you got 9,400 acre feet on 4,500 acres. I mean, that's about 2 acre feet per acre, and that's not enough water to irrigate almonds. I believe that, and Gabrielle would be a better expert than me, but yeah, my understanding is they need more than 3 acre feet per acre, 3 feet of water instead of 2 feet of water. So, you know, there will have to be other irrigation sources. Now, exactly how that works out, that's some of the issues we'll be looking at that says, you know, okay, there's 4,500 acres. Does this get spread equally across the 4,500 acres, or, you know, do the higher demand crops get 3 acre feet of water and the lower demand crops get 1 acre feet of this water, or exactly how does that work? So, you know, but I wanted to bring this to you because it is different than what we have seen. And I agree with you, Seth, that, you know, that dilution provides a little bit of that factor of safety that we wouldn't see. But the question becomes, if we have orders of magnitude of difference between what would be a problem, you know, versus what we are observing, then the question becomes, does, you know, adding twice as much produced water, is that going to create a scenario where that would be an issue? And I'll look to the experts, you know, and Dr. Schofield and Dr. Stringfellow and yourselves to help to answer that question of whether we need to do something different.
Yeah, just to respond quickly to that, I can see the logic of just adding a multiplier of 2, or what have you, if you're gonna, you know, eliminate blending. I can see that logic, but that logic is also heavily based on pretty limited sampling of a limited set of constituents. So again, you know, as I put in my previous comments, I think the main point here that I'm trying to make is it's incredibly important to have a firm grasp of all of the important factors here, and to have a firm grasp of what your monitoring approach is going to be, and be able to show defensively that it's appropriate to what's included. So again, I would just need to see more data to be able to even talk about it further, I think. But
Agreed.
yeah.
And the intent today, and the reason I said it would be a 15-minute discussion was because I just want to let you know these things are happening, you know, get some initial thoughts. So when we come back to you in July with more, we try to make sure we come back to you with a more robust package that will help to answer any questions. The other one, and
Let me
this
hold on. I just wanted to check in. I'd committed to Barbara. Barbara, any immediate response to Clay's question about any questions you have?
No, I don't have any.
Okay, and I'm hearing some background noise on your end, so you may want to mute your phone now. Again, Barbara. Go ahead, Clay.
Okay, the other project, this is a much smaller project, is from Hathaway Limited Liability Corporation, I guess probably a medium-sized oil producer. They provide water to the Kern-Tulare Water District, so this is the area north of Coelho Water District up by the Kern-Tulare County line. Jasmine Ranchos Mutual Water Company. I don't believe, have we received a report of waste discharge for this, or they've just come in and talked to us? We have the report of waste discharge. Here you kind of see the production, I think. Yeah, Highway 155 is the road that runs from Delano up to, across the 65 goes up to Glenville and the foothills. So it's, and this area right here, this is Highway 65, again, between Bakersfield. So the previous project was down in this area, and now we're looking at this particular project east of Delano. That's kind of general idea where it is. Oh, and here's the specifics. They would only increase their water usage by a couple hundred acre feet per year from 1,562 acre feet per year, which is what they're permitted to use, to 1,829 acre feet. So it's about a 10%, 15% increase in the total amount of water. It would also include the construction of a new equalization reservoir where they could store the water for longer periods of time so that they could enhance their ability to use some of the water for irrigation. Doesn't have to come directly out and used at the same time that it's produced. They can actually hold it for some period of time. But it's not a significant change. It's not a change in the source of the water from what's currently being used. But it is a project that, again, I wanted to bring to you. And, you know, again, this isn't something that would be considered by the board until, you know, late summer, fall at the earliest. And with that,
Bruce?
Hey, Clay,
that's basically what we have, as soon as I go the right direction.
Clay, just because folks are going to have to address the overdrafting issue in their future planning, do you have any reason to think that there's going to be more of these projects coming online? Because this is kind of free source of water that's out there. Is there going to be competition to try and utilize more of it and pay off Chevron or whomever with respect to the water?
My anticipation is that with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the overdraft issues in Kern County, that they're looking for all new sources of water. And this certainly is a new source of water. So there will be a desire to use water of appropriate quality, you know, to recycle that water for agricultural and groundwater recharge purposes. I think it's only going to increase and not decrease. That's my personal opinion.
Any other questions or comments from the panel? All right. With that, we're going to go ahead and open up the floor. Public comment first, just on this topic, if we could, just so we're sort of being sequential and Alex's notes are appropriate. Any questions or comments to the new WDRs? Okay, hearing none and seeing none, then we're going to go ahead and open up the floor for general public comment. Let me check in first, Rebecca. Any other email comments that have been brought in? Okay, the answer is no there. Any other public comment from the members of the public? Go ahead.
Hi there. My name's David Braun. Good afternoon. Thanks for holding this examination of whether the reuse of oil wastewater is safe for us to put into our bodies. Because I've been hearing, it seems like we're almost with some of the conclusions that some of the folks have made, that almost seems like this is a safe process, but I'm trying to understand now. You mentioned something about looking at my notes here. AB 1328, 55% of were those chemicals that have come to light that weren't being tested for before in the food? I'm trying to just better understand this process a little bit. I heard 55% sounds like chemicals that are being used haven't been tested for. Can somebody explain that to me?
Well, let me take a shot at it, and somebody else can help me if I mess it up a little bit. The constituents that we've been testing for are the major volatile organic compounds, semi-volatile organic compounds, and metals that have been, that are commonly analyzed by commercial analytical laboratories that are used in environmental studies that have typically been of significant environmental impact, either through water contamination or air problems, and that's really what a lot of those chemicals are based upon. The process we've gone through with this, and it's been a compelling question that we've taken very seriously, is that, the question becomes, do you know every possible chemical that could be in the water that's being used for irrigation?
Well, that's the chemicals that are being used, right?
Chemicals being used by the oil companies, either during the drilling of their wells, right, their oil wells, the maintenance of their oil wells, the maintenance of their production lines. And so that's what you're referring to, is that we've issued orders to the suppliers to tell us all the chemicals you're using and all the products and what are all the compounds that are included within those products, including what are considered the inert materials, so that we would have a complete listing. We're just getting a real good handle on what that is, and that legislation that Seth spoke of, 1328, was signed by the governor last fall, that gave us the authority to get trade secret information. Because in the past, from suppliers, since the suppliers weren't the dischargers, we didn't have the legal authority to require them to give us trade secreted information. So that's really the difference, so that as we move forward, we make sure that, we've basically covered everything from something that might be going in, at a tablespoon at a time with extreme dilution, to other compounds that may be used much more commonly and whatnot, is to make sure that we can stand up and say, we've looked at this very thoroughly, comprehensively, and none of, and that there isn't an issue with the safety of the food.
So when I hear statements like there's no smoking gun with the tests for the 5 or 6 constituents that I saw reviewed over there, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding all of this. So when you make a statement like that, is that taking into consideration how many, I imagine this is a pretty exhaustive list of chemicals that have serious deleterious effects on the human body if consumed. When sorts of statements are made by members of an expert panel that there's no smoking gun, when we haven't actually reviewed and tested all of these different chemical constituents, it seems a little reckless to me.
In defense of that panel member, if you listened carefully, what that panel member said is in terms of the constituents that we were looking at the data of those particular metals, panel member made it very clear that he was making no comment in that regard in terms of other chemicals, particularly the organic compounds. So just be very
Fair
clear,
enough.
making sure
Fair
that
enough.
you understood him correctly.
Right. And I think for a public process for which, sadly, there's not, I mean, I think probably it's safe to say that a fair amount of the folks that are here today are industry representatives rather than the general public who are looking out for public health, that with this information that's being shared, we're trying to get to the bottom of this to find out what is safe and what isn't. And if you actually heard those comments out of context, you would be led to believe, like if I was just tuning into this webcast and heard somebody on the expert panel saying, well, there's no smoking gun here, you might actually think, well, we're wrapping this all up. But it sounds to me like we're just getting started, especially with the understanding that this process is being expanded. I think that there is a lot here, and I appreciate that this panel has convened to consider these various serious procedures. And I think what would be good is perhaps for us all to collectively eat some of this food here while we're actually having these discussions, and perhaps drink some of this water to just demonstrate that we do feel that it's safe to be put on food for the general public. I mean, if we can't do it in a process here together, I don't see how we can expect the public to consume it. And honestly, this whole proceeding feels a little bit disconnected. So knowing that we're trying to get to the bottom of what is safe for public health and our children to consume, I just want to just bring a level of perspective here. Because sometimes I think within these rooms we lose our perspective in that, I mean, we could have thousands of people standing outside of, or even here, making a mockery of these proceedings, you know, or not, you know, as it currently isn't really happening right now. But I think that people would be very, very concerned to know exactly what's going on in their food and how that's being evaluated, and just knowing that it's being done responsibly. So I guess that's what we're all looking for, is responsible evaluation. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
I appreciate that. If I could, real quick, I just do want to, I appreciate your voice.
Patrick, go ahead and restate who you are, since you're
Patrick Palupa, incoming executive officer for the Central Valley Water Board. I appreciate that perspective. I mean, I would want to clarify that the current monitoring covers more than just a few constituents. I think that they want to present the ones that merited additional evaluation. And with respect to the very long list of constituents that we've been compiling, particularly due to the new legislation that lets us get at a lot of the trade secreted information that wasn't abundantly clear from the first round of sampling that happened first round of data that came in pursuant to the 13267 orders that were issued a couple years ago. That list is very extensive. I think Dr. Mackler kind of touched on the process that, you know, the scientists and the technical staff at the board go through. That has been done for many industries throughout the Central Valley, throughout the country, and that you have a long list of constituents. You analyze them. Some of them you cross off because they're not going to be a big concern, and there's scientific literature proving that they're not going to be a big concern. And then there's others that merit additional study. So of the 260 some, I think there's certainly not all of those are deleterious to human health, but there are a few that we want to study more. I think the panel was pretty transparent in saying we have some conclusions with respect to some of the work done so far, and that there's additional study that is merited, not just, you know, right now, but over the years to come. And from the board's perspective, that's the type of information that we're going to look at, because you're exactly right. This process is going to expand in years to come. I fully anticipate that there will be more folks lining up to try and use this water, and the board is absolutely interested in having this process continue. And same with any other regulated industry. the board doesn't call it done. We're still looking at, say, constituents of emerging concerns, and wastewater treatment plants have been regulated since the 50s and 60s. I mean, this is a process that's ongoing. It's something that merits a lot more study once this came up onto our radar, and that's why we've got this panel here today.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that very much, and thank you for providing that greater perspective, and I appreciate the good work that you and this panel are doing. With all due respect, I offer my comments to this process, and thank you. With regard to that, though, I would say when we are proposing looking at a new field, we should also not only be looking at where the field is located, but how about the chemical constituents that are being used? And I get that the oil industry has a right to do its operations as it needs to, but what I also understand, as soon as you cross that line where this is entering into consumption, we should know actually the quantities of those chemicals that are being used in those fields in exact amounts. We should know how and when those things are being used, if we're actually going to be putting this stuff in our bodies or be using it on food. I mean, it just imagines, bringing water into some mother's garden and being like, we're not really sure. And you would have pretty much every mom on the block saying, no way. So I think that since this is the collective garden, there's an incredible responsibility that we all have to know what's gone into that water and how much of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Other public comment or questions at this time? All right, hearing none and seeing none, I'll check in with the panel one last time. Any comments from the panel or questions? Staff? Leadership? All right. I will note that a comment had been provided to me during the break that there is a concern that as a process we are not getting certain materials posted on time or as early as some people would like, agendas, past meeting summaries, and then presentations. So just as a general note, we will continue to do our efforts, CCP will, and working with the regional board to make sure that presentations are posted in advance so people can see, and that agendas and meeting summaries are getting posted in a timely manner. So that was commented to me. I want to go ahead and get that in the record of the process. With that, I'm going to call us adjourned for the day. Thank you very much, everybody, to plugging through and being done a little bit early. So everybody have a great week and a great weekend, and we will see you all in a few months. We are adjourned.